Thank you very much, Porrick. It's a pleasure to give this talk, and it has very little to do with AI. It does have to do with brains, though. Brains are intriguing things, and the language with which we discuss brains these days very often uses the vocabulary of information processing, and an analogy is drawn sometimes strongly, sometimes less strongly, with the operations of a digital computer. It's almost hard to get away from this language. If we look at the way that, my slides will work, come along, there we go. If we look at the kinds of representations of brains that we encounter in the media, we get a view of a sort of a multifaceted organ that plays very many roles. There are brain training programs out there, for example, that treat the brain as if it was a kind of a muscle, which through exercise can be improved or made more efficient in some sense. Of course, that would assume that you know what a brain is doing. Brains don't lift weights, contrary to that particular illustration. There's been an awful lot of improvement recently in our ability to image brains, and in particular to image real-time physiological activity in brains. So much so that we are almost inundated with images like there on the top right, with colorful blobs overlaid on brains. These have become, while they do neuroscience great service, they also become somewhat problematic because people read things into them that perhaps they shouldn't. So one thing to clarify, for example, is that brains don't actually light up, and the blobs there are merely drawings, cartoons overlaid to identify specific areas in a caricature of a brain. There is a massive industry built around the notion that that a proper causal account of human behavior would make reference almost exclusively to something called a cognitive system. This is often conceived of as mechanisms within mechanisms contained within the brain, which give rise to behavior. On this view, the mind, or our rich mental lives, arises through the activity of the brain, particularly. It's a conventional orthodox view, but it's not the only game in town. And I want, in this talk, to sort of see where this view came from, to trace its origins, because the widespread acceptance of this vocabulary can hide the fact that it rests on a lot of assumptions which need to be we need to be conscious of these assumptions and to be cautious in going beyond them without bound. And down on the bottom right there, you see a peculiar kind of imagery of a blue glowing brain. There are many, many blue glowing brains out there in the media landscape. It seems to this blue color is itself a problem. It's a characteristic of a particular view, one might say an extreme view of brains, which leads to such concepts as the singularity and the idea that whatever you are can be captured in bits and bytes and might someday be downloaded and could be implemented on something other than a brain and a body. Very odd idea indeed, and I think it's worthwhile figuring out how we got here. I won't have too much to say about where we're going from here, but this is really a historical talk because the story is interesting and the characters that we meet along the way are a very colorful bunch indeed. They tend to have very strong opinions. They tend to have very odd opinions. They occupy all points on the scale of religiosity, from militant atheist to extreme religious mystic, and they have a wide variety of agendas. And it's useful to know that when you see how this story came about. Now, the idea, so widespread currently, that we could identify places in the brain to whom some kind of functional responsibility could be attributed, so that there might be a place in the brain that is responsible for speaking, or for emotion, or planning, or for executive control. This is an old idea, and it goes back to a defunct science, a science no one really thinks of as a science anymore, which is phrenology. Phrenology was an old idea, originated in the 18th century, reached its peak in the early 19th century. This is an illustration from the American Phrenological Journal from 1848. You can see there that the cartoon drawings extend over an area of the head far greater than that covered by the brain. The brain would be a small area in there. Phrenology took an older idea of faculty psychology, the idea that our lives, our mental lives, can be carved up into distinct competences, and that these might be located in specific places in the brain. It took this and went one step beyond to hypothesize that one might even tell much about someone's character or personality from the outward form of the skull, which was presumed to reflect the relative size of the underlying organs within the brain. So phrenology saw the brain as a composite made up of organs, individual organs, which had specific responsibilities. Some of these would be things we would probably not go looking for in brains today, things like the poetic talent, for example, or morality. These are not things that we would today expect to find in the brain, but this idea that there are specific places in the brain who have specific tasks, and these tasks give rise to behavior that we can interpret, this hasn't gone away, and it remains something of a threat to our understanding, our scientific understanding of ourselves. Here's, for example, from a website called hiddentalents.org, here's a weird mashup of some stuff that's not entirely wrong about the brain and some stuff that's entirely wishful thinking about the brain. So here, mapped onto the brain, we have things like body senses, motor control, imagination, inhibition, what not to do, right, wrong behavior, manners, conscience, memory, muscle coordination, mental mathematics, vision, learning how to do things, play sports, musical instruments, and habits. And for each of these, there are arrows pointing to specific places in the brain. Phrenology has not gone away. Indeed, many of the assumptions of phrenology stay with us in the discipline of cognitive science. One orthodoxy within orthodox cognitive science is that minds are, roughly speaking, modular. That is, that they decompose into functionally encapsulated little individual domains responsible for such things as vision or speaking, and so on. And so we always need to be careful about the stories we tell about our brain, because there's clearly a lot of imaginative projection here. And our ability to project onto this wonderful organ seems to be almost unlimited. Many of you will have encountered stories about right brains and left brains, as illustrated here, for example, where a whole bunch of very value-laden judgments are associated with one half of the brain or the other half of the brain. It must be said the brain is has two halves. Okay, that much is correct, and they don't do exactly the same thing. That is correct. But the idea that logical thinking, verbal thinking, order, math, rational, masculinity, systems, analytic stuff is left brain, whereas creativity, emotion, music playing, nice colors, and art lie in the right brain, is utter twaddle. But it's very widespread twaddle. And it comes from an egregious misreading of what we do know about brains and a desire to project ourselves upon our brains and to see ourselves in there. In some sense, the brain has become the ultimate fetish object of the 21st century, where we believe people reside in there. There's just this morning's Savage Chickens cartoon, in which a little bit of creative phrenology is done, distinguishing the stupid bits from the smart bits in the brain, which is fine. How did we get here? It's kind of odd, because if you look inside a skull, the brain that you see is a medium-sized lump of fatty meat. It's very high in cholesterol, and it's a physical object. And so to project this kind of image of ourselves, of things that we hold dear, onto a lump of meat is kind of odd. And so we're going to go back. We're going to start with a strong Irish connection to George Boole. George Boole, who was for a while a professor of mathematics in University College Cork, he started off as a school teacher actually in England, and he did a lot of his work, his published work was done before he took up the professorship. He never bothered getting a degree because he thought it would slow down his research, which I think is great. So he went from being a school teacher to being a professor. And one of his most important books, here written 10 years before he died, was called The Laws of Thought, or more fully, an investigation of the laws of thought on which are founded the mathematical theories of logic and probabilities. Boole was a logician and a mathematician. And he had discovered that one could map from the tools and elements of logic onto propositions. So the development of propositional logic means that we can do reasoning, mathematical deductive reasoning, using propositions, which are statements about the world. Boole's singular contribution was to unite algebra and logic so that one could write algebraic statements, which one could interpret as being about the world, for example. One could write them, and one could use the mechanics of algebra in order to deduce further propositions. Now, the nice thing about deductive reasoning in logical systems is that you don't go wrong. If your premises are correct at the start and you follow the rules of logic, you should at all times end up with something which is consistent and as valid as your premises. That, of course, is a big if. He was improving here and systematizing a practice which had been around for donkey's years. So the Greeks were well-known logicians. Logic was a branch of mathematics that was cared for over thousands of years. But this formulation of it, in which you're quite familiar, truth conditions were represented as the numbers 1 and 0. This is the Boolean logic which inheres and at the heart of all digital computers, gave us a really powerful tool for doing some reasoning. So here's an example. If we take a proposition of this nature, wealth consists of things transferable, limited in supply, and either productive of pleasure or preventative of pain. That's a proposition about affairs in the world. We can then code that into a mathematical statement on which we can do algebra once we've adopted Boole's approach to this. And so there follow some intermediate steps which we're not concerned with here, which gives us a new proposition. Here's the conclusion: wealth consists of all things limited in supply, transferable and productive of pleasure, and an indefinite remainder of things limited in supply, transferable and not productive of pleasure. So there's a little bit of set theory going on behind the curtain there. But what we have is a new proposition. It's not wildly different from the original proposition, because when you do deductive reasoning, you don't get things that are wildly different from your premises, but you get things that are significantly differently structured from your premises. And if your premise is a true statement, then your conclusions should all be true. Now, Boole was convinced that in doing so, he had found a way to mechanize reasoning, as it were. Now, reasoning we have a long history in this part of the world of considering the power of reason as that which sets man apart from the brute beast. This has theological undercurrents, of course, and it belongs squarely in a camp of rationalist philosophy, which valorizes reasoning. We're actually not so good at reasoning, as many of us are all too painfully aware, but we're probably better than dogs at reasoning anyway. So Boole was convinced he had discovered the laws of thought, and then he upped and popped his clogs on for it in a very unfortunate fashion. The story is told in Wikipedia. He got wet walking home, and his wife was of the opinion that one should treat the disease with the cause, sort of a mad kind of homeopathy, and she poured buckets of water over him in bed. He'd come in with a chill, and he died of a chill, unfortunately. He's buried down in Cork. And that's his gravestone. We should all go visit that someday, I think. So we have much to thank George Boole for, and we certainly wouldn't have our modern information processing vocabulary in our digital computers without him. So we're going to move along. We're going to stick here with mathematics and logic for a little bit, not descend into brains for a while. First, the next character we meet is Bertrand Russell. Now, here is a really, really eccentric, interesting character. He was a mathematician, a logician, a philosopher. He was an activist. He had very, very passionate convictions. He was arrested several times during his life. In 1916, he got a £100 fine and 2 months in Brixton prison in 1918. At age 89 in 1961, he was still at it, and he was arrested in anti-war protests. So a man of strong convictions, also an Earl, so part of the establishment. And he was an advocate of free love and open marriage, and a very strong militant atheist, who, if he was ever dragged up in front of St. Peter on the way to heaven, he said he would simply say, "God, you didn't give us enough evidence," which is a reasonable thing to do. Perhaps you get a sense of him here, and I actually have a little recording so you can hear what Bertrand Russell sounded like. He's a very fascinating chap.
All human activity is prompted by desire. There is a wholly fallacious theory advanced by some earnest moralists to the effect that it is possible to resist desire in the interest of duty and moral principle. I say this is fallacious, not because no man ever acts from a sense of duty, but because duty has no hold on him unless he desires to be dutiful. If you wish to know what men will do, you must know not only or principally their material circumstances, but rather the whole system of their desires with their relative strengths.
That's Bertrand Russell. Bless him. His teacher at Cambridge was Alfred North Whitehead here. Whitehead was a much more private character, so Bertrand Russell lived his life very much in the public eye. Whitehead was also something of a mystic. He had very advanced, impenetrable metaphysical views. And he had been thinking along the same lines as Bertrand Russell with respect to George Boole's idea about having discovered the laws of thought. They didn't actually concur, or they didn't follow Boole's line of argumentation that he had discovered the laws of thought. They thought he had discovered the laws of mathematics. So there's obviously some room for interpretation here. They hoped that mathematics would reduce to logic. Now, logic uses a very small set of primitives and a very small set of operations to deduce propositions from prior propositions. Bertrand Russell claimed that mathematics is symbolic logic and that this was a discovery of the age. And he set out to demonstrate this by converting the whole of known mathematics into a set of logical statements. He did this together with Whitehead, and they produced a massive work called the Principia Mathematica. There it is. They had been working independently on this, and they collaborated on this. It's, I guess one could say, not much of a good read. It is worth looking at, and here's actually an excerpt from the Principia Mathematica. This is from part of the derivation that's required in order to show that 1 + 1 = 2. This is an incomplete part of it, and because you need also the mechanics of arithmetical addition here. So saying anything in this language is laborious at best. But that's not the point. The point was that they thought that they had, thanks to the good offices of George Boole, they had the means by which one could deduce the whole of mathematics. And if we could then, for example, mechanize this, well, enormous progress would follow. In doing so, they were bouncing off a much older question. They wanted to capture the whole of mathematics by means of a set of axioms, together with some logical rules of inference. And with that, one has to ask, how far do logic and deduction go? What can one reasonably expect from processes of deduction, from the drawing of conclusions from premises using the operations of logic? Now, they were not the first ones to consider this. Perhaps the most famous person here is Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant, in his critique of pure reason, had asked himself something very, very similar, which was, if we apply our reason, what could we in principle find out? And were there limits to the amount of things that we could find out? And Kant was of the opinion, although his opinion developed and changed over his lifetime, that reason had its bounds, and there would probably be statements or things that we would encounter that we would have to admit were true, but that we could not deduce by pure reason. But Kant was doing all this using an awful lot of words. He's not terrifically easy to read, to be honest with you, and he was doing it without the formal machinery of logic. At the start of the 20th century, there was some other contributions from within mathematics, now not from within philosophy, that pointed to similar limitations on what we might hope from reasoning powers. And Kurt Gödel, an eccentric mathematician, produced a rather surprising contribution with his famous incompleteness theorem, which showed that if we have a sufficiently powerful formal system, and a logical system that can deduce the truths of mathematics certainly is such a system, then there must be truths which were expressible within the system, but which could not be derived through a process of deduction from the axioms of the system. This is incompleteness theorem, points mathematically to a very strict limit to what we might hope to achieve using logical reasoning and logic. You can see that these thinkers are trying to be very, very general. To try and deduce the whole of mathematics, for example, is quite big. To deduce the laws of thought is ambitious, if nothing else. Gödel here is making a very principled, basic statement that holds irrespective of a whole lot of details, and will be true of any sufficiently powerful formal system. There was another great contribution in the 1930s from Alan Turing, which is so well known in these circles I don't have to talk about it much. We've met it actually in the last lecture on information theory. But the famous Turing machine, or more particularly the universal Turing machine, is a formalism which is capable of computing anything which can be computed. It's a result which illustrates that it is possible to arrive at very general statements in the domain of deduction and computation. But of course, if there are limits, absolute limits to what we can deduce, as for example Gödel had suggested and Kant had intuited, then there may well be things that we still cannot compute. Of course, we know all about halting problems and things like that. But what's going on here? Boole had claimed he had discovered the laws of thought, and Russell and Whitehead had changed that somewhat and said he discovered the laws of mathematics. Now, Gödel's theorem made the Principia Mathematica redundant, unfortunately. It's an awful lot of work to be made redundant, but they showed that the goal of complete derivation was not possible. But underlying these various interpretations of what Boolean logic is actually about are different views of what mathematics is about. Mathematics is a peculiar sort of activity. We in UCD have it here in the College of Science. It's not always in the College of Science, and it's not clear to everyone that mathematics is a science. The degree to which mathematics is invented or discovered is a perennial favorite of philosophers. And there's a whole bunch of really meaty, interesting philosophical problems revolving around the relationship of mathematics to thought on the one hand. When do we think in propositions? Are our thoughts true or false? Can we apply similar considerations to our thoughts as we can to statements in logic, for example? And the relationship between mathematics and the world. Now, there's no God-given reason why mathematics should work, but it is, as Wigner said, unreasonably effective in the world. And we just find that mathematics helps us an awful lot, even if we are somewhat clueless as to why mathematics is so spectacularly powerful. These debates will not be solved by anything I have to say here, but we've reached the end of this first path, which I wanted to walk through from Boole up to about the 1930s, 1940s, where something really special happens. Now we want to go to these things, brains. And we need to turn the clock back a little bit. And we're going to go back to 1906, where the Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology was first jointly awarded. This was the first joint award. Joint awards are very commonplace nowadays. And it went to two physiologists, Ramon y Cajal and Camillo Golgi. These are the two guys. They shared it. Fantastic mustaches, especially Golgi. Now, Golgi had invented a staining technique which allowed the fine detail of the branching structure of neurons, the individual nerve cells, in the outer layers of the cortex of the brain, to be illustrated very, very, very clearly. It was a technique that used silver nitrate, and this was the first time that people saw these highly complex branching structures that we're actually quite familiar with these days. Both Golgi and Ramon y Cajal worked with Golgi's staining technique, which is known as a Golgi stain. You can see some of the wonderful detail that we can get from this. These are more modern uses, and Golgi staining is still a very, very useful technique. It illustrates some cells, and it gets rid of all the confusion that arises from all the other stuff in the brain, because there's not only these nerve cells, there's a lot of other stuff going on in the brain, insulating them, supporting them, supplying them with nutrients, and all that kind of thing. It's useful, actually, and perhaps artistically, to look at drawings made by Golgi and by Ramon y Cajal. One gets a sense of two very different people. These are Golgi's drawings himself, based on his technique. You can see that there's complex links between the various strands that are shown here. And it contrasts quite a lot with a drawing made by Cajal. Here's Ramon y Cajal's version using the same technique. Notice how much clearer things are here. If we go back here, everything is ridiculously intertwined. It looks like a big tangle, where here individual nerves with their projections are drawn out very, very clearly. Now, there are limits to what you can see using this technique, so there was room for some quite substantive disagreement between these guys in interpreting what they were seeing. They had different views of what we should be looking for in brains, and to some extent they both exhibited confirmation bias in that they both saw and then drew by hand accounts of the connectivity among nerve cells that fitted their own theory. Golgi was a fan of what is called reticular theory. He believed that the basic functional units within the central nervous system, the basic unit that we should be concerned with in our account of human experience and human behavior, was a network of neurons. Neurons are these individual nerve cells. That's a distributed network. He said there's no point in going below that. There must be, what we're looking for here is the right level of description for the elements which contribute meaningfully to our experience and our behavior. On Golgi's account, there was no point in looking below the level of the network of neurons, whereas Cahal thought that the individual neuron itself was a more appropriate level with which to describe operations in the brain. Here you see a diagram of a neuron. You can see a cell body with a load of, these are called dendrites. These are anterior connections to neurons behind it. You can think of these as inputs, if you like. And this is an axon, which is a long projection which goes down and makes contact with lots of other nerves. Now, typically, an individual neuron will receive incoming connections from about 10,000 other nerves and will project to about 10,000 other nerves. One of the crucial details that they were missing was what happens at the gaps between the neurons. Golgi believed that there was direct electrical to electrical contact and that the brain was an electrical signaling system. Cahal correctly believed that there was no direct contact usually between neurons and that the connections between neurons were of a different nature. In fact, they are chemical connections, and the brain is in fact an electrochemical processor and not merely an electrical processor, and in that lies a wealth of detail that is extremely relevant to understanding brain function. We've come a long way since then. But it must have been fun to be present at the Nobel Prizes because these guys couldn't stand each other. They got up and they gave their speeches together, and they have completely different views of what goes on, and they start calling each other names in public. And Cahal later accused Golgi of having a strange mental constitution that was hermetically sealed against criticism by its egocentricity. This is undignified behavior of scientists in public, but there you go. So one of them had to win, and it was Cahal's view that won out, especially as we got better and better microscopy, and we could uncover an awful lot more detail about those connections between individual nerve cells, and we came to appreciate the importance of that little point of chemical transmission. The neuron doctrine was born. The neuron doctrine is this conviction that the correct level at which we want to look at the nervous system if we want to understand its operation to provide our causal accounts of human experience and behavior is the individual neuron. That neuron doctrine has reigned supreme now for over 100 years. It must be said it's under threat at the moment. We have found very many exceptions to the neuron doctrine, almost every part of it. But as a first guess, as a first pass approximation to what's going on in the nervous system, it is pretty damn good. Here's the star of the show. It's a neuron, an individual cell. There you can see the dendrites on the left. You can see the axonal projection, and it's wrapped up in a kind of insulation through myelin sheath. And then you can see the axonal projections down here, which would pass on to other ones. And this is, of course, a very dynamic thing. Here's a childish illustration of a neuron working. You can see it accepting chemical signals from other neurons. They are roughly summed, and then when that sum reaches a critical threshold, an all or nothing electrical pulse called a spike starts traveling down the axon. It gets to the far end where it causes the release of chemicals, thereby providing input to other neurons. This is the basic way that neurons operate. Not much change then between 1906 and the 1940s, 1950s that we're next going to be concerned with. The neuron doctrine rapidly became established, much to Golgi's, I'm sure he wasn't very happy about it. But what we're going to do now is we're going to go forward to a character who many of you may not know, who is probably the most important character in all this, and this is Warren McCulloch. That's Warren McCulloch over there on the left. He's got a fabulous looking beard. He's a very intense guy. He lived quite long. He died in 1969. On the right is Walter Pitts, and the model that they came up with of the neuron that informs very many of our theories about the brain is known as the McCulloch-Pitts model. Pitts was a very bright graduate student who was hiding out in McCulloch's house. He had to run away from home because his dad didn't like him doing science and maths. The actual ideas are probably more correctly attributed to Warren McCulloch, and he was a much more public person. He wrote an awful lot. He collaborated with very many people, and the most important paper probably that he did was this 1943 paper in the Bulletin of Mathematical Biophysics, A Logical Calculus of the Ideas Immanent in Nervous Activity. It's worth having a little look at Warren McCulloch. Here he is. He was a man of many hats. He was a philosopher, he was a psychologist, he had practiced psychiatry, he had a medical degree, he was one of the founders of the discipline of cybernetics. He was quite a poet, quite an accomplished poet as well, and he was an engineer. He did an awful lot of things, in other words, and his writings are challenging and fascinating. Just to give you a little sense of him, I hope this played.
Do you think we'll make a machine to equal the brain, the human mind?
As far as arithmetic is concerned, they're already way ahead of us.
I mean in general, memory, idea formation, a soul, so to speak. You know, when first the machines came out, everybody thought that they did in fact.
I'm sorry, let's leave the soul out.
All right. Well, do you think that the computer will approximate the human mind in all respects?
Computing machines think with a language which is number. Everything else we transfer into number to make them work.
He's sitting somewhere on the fence there. He says, computing machines think in the language which is number. So he seems to think that there's something analogous to thinking, at the very least, going on inside machines. Here's an excerpt, just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what's going on in McCulloch's head. It's important to understand what kind of a character he was. Here's an excerpt from one of his later essays called Why the Mind is in the Head. And look at this kind of prose. Coming as I do between psyche anatomized and psyche synthesized, I must so define my terms that I can bridge the traditional gulf between mind and body and the technical gap between things begotten and things made. The joy of creating ideals, new and eternal, in and of a world old and temporal, robots have it not. For this my mother bore me. And he doesn't mean she was boring. Look at that language. The psyche anatomized, this is the study of physiology. The psyche synthesized, this is artificial intelligence, I suppose. The language here, though, the concern to differentiate between things begotten and things made. I don't know if that's setting off any little bells there. Those of you who have a good Catholic education will recognize that from the Nicene Creed, where we talk of begotten, not made, just before we say of one substance with the Father, or in Latin, genitum non factum. And this highlights a very important aspect to Warren McCulloch. He was a deeply religious man, and his understanding of the nervous system was fully informed by his approach to religion and his quest to account for immanence and the Godhead. I don't know how he did this, but he got this paper into a journal called Scientific Monthly. The title of the paper is Mysterium Iniquitatis of Sinful Man Aspiring into the Place of God. I defy any of you to get a paper with that title into an engineering or a scientific journal these days. It would be great. As a young man, he was reared in a very strongly religious family. They were Episcopalians, and he went to an Ammonite professor, which accounts for the weird grammar, as he was a young graduate student. This is a famous conversation that happened. He was a young guy looking for a supervisor for his PhD. The guy said, "Warren, what are thee going to do?" And Warren said, "I have no idea, but there's one question I would like to answer. What is a number that man may know it, and a man that he may know a number?" So it goes both ways. It's a beautiful formulation. It's a wonderful question. It's actually two questions, of course, but they're so closely related. And his professor said, "Friend, thee will be busy as long as thee lives," which was quite correct. So Warren McCulloch was deeply religious in outlook. He had another sort of side to his personality. He was fascinated by the military. He had a deep love of the organization that found within the military. This is something he shared with John von Neumann, the inventor of the digital computer. And although Warren McCulloch must be considered one of the founders of the discipline of artificial intelligence, he wasn't interested in developing series, machines that could respond appropriately, that could play chess, that could solve puzzles, that could use natural language. He was interested in knowing how we could ultimately work towards machines that would desire, would enjoy, would yearn, and would feel. His was a concern for phenomenology. It was desire to understand nervous systems so that they could account for lived experience. Now that's a very large task, but you can see we're meeting people who have very large ideas here. Now when it came to the nervous system, he made a very, very bold move. Here's one schematic view of a single neuron, and that illustrates a little bit of the complexity of a neuron. Our best models these days of an individual nerve cell have thousands of variables. Nerve cells are complicated things, right? The version we saw before left out an awful lot of that complexity and reduced it to this. McCulloch went much, much further. He took the functioning of a nerve cell, and he took those spikes we mentioned. Here's a recording of a train of spikes from one nerve cell. You can see they're distributed in time, for example. And he looked at them and he noticed one property of a spike, which is that it's either there or it's not there. It's not halfway there. These spikes, or action potentials as they're more properly known, are discrete events which are all or nothing kinds of things. That reminded him of the business of logic, where things are either true or false, where the bits are either on or off. And he thought, perhaps there's a deep link to be made here. He came up with a stylization, a caricature of the individual neuron, known now as the McCulloch-Pitts neuron, which is this little baby. Those taking any courses in connectionism or artificial neural nets are terrifically familiar with this. This is a simple computational unit that sums its inputs, and if those inputs pass a certain level, a threshold, it generates an output value, and that value is passed on through weighted connections to other units. It's a very, very simple little element out of which we can build quite complex models. This is the basic unit with which the whole of the field of connectionism or artificial neural networks is born. So that's just one thing that he gave us, of course. Coming back to that essay from 1943, The Logical Calculus of the Ideas Immanent in Nervous Activity, this is definitely a paper which is more often cited than read, but it's worth reading at the very least the abstract, where you get a good feel for it. Because of the all or nothing character of nervous activity, neural events and the relations among them can be treated by means of propositional logic. That's the most important sentence in this whole talk. The on-off nature, the fact that a spike is either there or not, makes a direct link to propositional logic to the ones and zeros of Boolean algebra. By wiring up connections of these, you can generate then sets of logic gates that compute logical functions. He distinguishes here carefully between what we would now call a feed-forward network and a recurrent network, noting that they have very different properties. But his point is to show that on his view of the nervous system, nervous systems can implement these logical functions. And here's a diagram from the paper, and these are hypothetical assemblies of those little caricatures of neurons, the McCulloch-Pitts neuron, which implement logical functions like and, or, not, exclusive, or, and such like. This is at the very heart of it. And so he believed that if you interpreted, if you viewed the nervous system as he viewed the nervous system, with the enormous simplifications that are required to ground the McCulloch-Pitts neuron, then you could regard the physiological activity of the cortex as a kind of computation. And here, of course, we've got a perfect storm in a way. He was aware of the work of Alan Turing, and he made the bold claim that he and Walter Pitts had shown that the brain is a Turing machine. Now, we need to be very careful before we accept that. What he had shown is that if you understand the brain in the way that Warren McCulloch understands the brain, that it is a Turing machine. But the way that Warren McCulloch understands the brain is very far removed from the actual business of brains. There are certain premises that his claims rest on. One is that the ideas and the mind are objects that can be studied quantitatively. The other is that binary logic is the correct formalism required for this job. You see, McCulloch has wholeheartedly swallowed the Kool-Aid from George Boole. He believes that Boole has provided the laws of thought, and McCulloch is just looking to show how that could be the case. And to do so, you need to show that the brain implements binary logic in a manner suited for generating minds. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in an intellectual climate in which an awful lot was going on. Let's have a look at what was going on around this time. Information theory had just been born in Bell Labs through Claude Shannon, of course. The von Neumann computer architecture had come along, so we had real electronic computers which were capable of performing calculations at hitherto unknown rates, and which spoke of a future in which computation would acquire increasing significance. We had the whole business of computability, the work of Alan Turing. There was a discipline which is largely ignored in computer science departments these days, which is cybernetics. Now, Warren McCulloch was one of the people who founded this domain of cybernetics. It's very much associated with the birth of the modern computer. Cybernetics is the study of feedback-controlled systems. If you want an example of one, think of a target, of a missile that finds its own target. It latches onto a heat target, for example. That is a system that steers itself through a feedback-controlled system. There was an awful lot of the work at this stage, as usual, of course, was funded by the military, who were interested in developing cybernetic theory for precisely this reasons. They wanted to create machines that could be put out and would act autonomously. It's against this background that we have Warren McCulloch's extraordinary mystical and religious view coming along, interpreting the brain as a computing machine. That wouldn't have made sense even 20 years earlier. Now it makes all kinds of sense. And this perfect storm, which gave rise to a massive change in the vocabularies used in the philosophy of mind, used in psychology, used in, well, the origins of computer science, of course, made possible, it's almost like humanity took a left turn. We suddenly started thinking very, very differently about ourselves, and it spawned children. This gave us the modern disciplines of cognitive psychology, artificial intelligence, and generative linguistics. It's worth noting, perhaps, that there was a very serious funding decision made in the 60s by DARPA, the principal military funding agency, which decided to back artificial intelligence in opposition to cybernetics, which led to the cybernetics migrated to engineering departments, where it becomes the study of control systems, and the massive big grant from the Army went and funded Marvin Minsky in the MIT lab and the development of artificial intelligence around there. McCulloch had made enormous contributions here. His neuroscience contributions are beyond doubt. But to the emerging information control and computing sciences, he gave a bit of a vision. He showed how, if you shared his view, you could go beyond this business of logical operations, which was the basis for calculation, and show how minds could be built out of brain stuff. So McCulloch sits here at a conjunction of two lines of thought. On the one hand, he sides with Boole against Russell and Whitehead. He thinks Boolean algebra genuinely is, or provides a basis for implementing thought, right? We have to remember, of course, we've already encountered some limits that we might place on that kind of an interpretation, but McCulloch is a wholehearted supporter of Boole's notion. He also stands at the important development in neuroscience, where the neuron, taken as the individual functional unit of the nervous system, has become indubitable, and he reduces that to a simple computational unit that can compute logical functions. This is why we think of brains as computers. An awful lot has happened since then. My goal here today has been primarily to present this historical overview, but I did say that this perfect storm gave rise to a lot of disciplines, including artificial intelligence, cognitive neuroscience, cognitive psychology, generative linguistics, and such. Now, subsequent work has led to the proliferation of other approaches as well. There's been an awful lot of work that has been concerned with looking at the role of the body in cognition. We might talk of an embodied movement, and a lot of that has been informed by robotics, the business of building machines that get by in the world, which turn out to need smarts, as it were, in their entire construction and not just in their computer chips. More recently, some topics that used to be off bounds for scientific study, but which would have interested Warren McCulloch very greatly. I think the study of consciousness, the scientific treatment of the emotions, and the scientific links to the philosophical discipline known as phenomenology, which is concerned with understanding experience. We're developing scientific approaches to these, which are quite foreign to the assumptions and methods shown in the top one. And this has gone on, though. There's new things as well. Artificial intelligence has kind of peeled itself off. The goals of artificial intelligence have changed an awful lot. We're familiar with the GOFI label, good old-fashioned artificial intelligence, which distinguishes it from the many different goals of artificial intelligence today, a lot of which have very little to do with minds or humans or brains, a lot of which actually have to do with supporting intelligent behavior, with interacting in a loop with humans to make things possible that were not otherwise possible, not necessarily to display autonomous intelligence. Of course, that work also goes on. Data science and artificial intelligence are having some interesting interactions at the moment in the field of machine learning. The field of machine learning also has very interesting relations to the artificial neural networks that McCulloch gave us. And then there are radically different approaches that have come up, which I'll characterize as the mind and life school, philosophical movements known as inaction, looking at minds, brains, and bodies as significantly embedded in their environments and ununderstandable without them. The discipline of ecological psychology that again looks at the embedding of an organism in its environment. These do not adopt that vocabulary, so there are approaches now which just take alternative tacks. And these all coexist. It's not the case, has never been really been the case, that innovation in one discipline makes everything else redundant. Rather, some people follow on the old traditions and we get a lot of coexisting traditions. So if we might graph things here, there on the left, you've got confidence that the brain can be understood as a computer, ranging from very high in those cognitive-based disciplines, for example, a little lower perhaps when we get into artificial neural networks, lower still when we talk about the role of the body, and when we switch the language then from computation to dynamical systems, perhaps we have zero faith that the brain is usefully understood as a computational system. These all coexist these days as possibilities, and there's a lot of very good active work going on in all of these. And of course, a lot of failure to understand each other going on between these. It's worth noting that we live in a very, very rich intellectual environment in which multiple and perhaps incompatible approaches coexist. There's nothing wrong with that. I want to finish up with this. This is what a brain actually looks like. It's not blue and glowing. It doesn't light up. It is fatty. It's not obviously a computer. It's not obviously not a computer. Nothing that I've said today should convince you that it is or is not a computer. If you want to adopt the view that the brain is a computer, you have now a thread to follow. It's worth engaging with these ideas, finding out and forming your own view of what it was that George Boole did, whether you choose to side with Warren McCulloch or with Russell and Whitehead, about the accomplishments of George Boole. If you go along with Warren McCulloch, it's well worth spending some time with the man himself. He is very, very rewarding. He's a fascinating character. And it's largely from him and that conjunction of insights in neuroscience, which of course are always changing themselves, with this theoretical mathematical strand, that we get this view of the brain as a computer. But then we have to come back to where we started, which is why do we project so much on here? Now, what is a computer? A computer, the set of associations that come with the term computation and computers has grown enormously, of course. The people in this room probably have very specific and strong associations and possibly very well-grounded associations. Go outside of here, of course, computers are the means by which people obtain pornography, watch movies, listen to music, share with their friends, tweet online. That's computers for everybody else, for the rest of the world. That we should project onto the brain in this fashion is somewhat of a problem for those of us who are concerned with trying to improve the story of what the brain is. There seems to be an almost unlimited capacity in our society to project our views of ourselves on here. It's interesting that religion played a very strong role in what we spoke about today. Now, I downplayed it somewhat, but you can't get away from the religious basis for Warren McCulloch's efforts here. The projection of the self onto the brain seems to lie in a particular place. It obviously has a cultural and historical origin, and in order to understand it, you really have to understand the situation in which that could have arisen. We could have gone much further back. We could have traced this back from the Greeks through the Middle Ages, through the birth of modern European philosophy and so on. We chose not to, but really, if you want to understand, if you want to have a strong view on whether the brain is or is not profitably viewed as a computer, I think you can't ignore the fact that these stories arise in context and they're driven by some of the most colorful, energetic, interesting people in the entire world. And I'll just stop there and leave it with the brain.